The Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science by Thomas Troward. Forward. The present volume contains the substance of a course of lectures recently delivered by the writer in the Queen Street Hall, Edinburgh. Its purpose is to delineate the natural principles governing the relation between mental action and material conditions, and thus to afford the student an intelligible starting point for the practical study of the subject. Thomas Troward, March 1904, Chapter 1. Spirit and Matter. The Essence of Spirit and Matter. Initiating a series of lectures upon mental science presents a distinct challenge in determining the most effective method of introducing the topic. It offers multiple points of entry, each possessing its own peculiar merit. However, after mature consideration, the most appropriate starting place for this course appears to be the relationship between spirit and matter. This choice is predicated upon the familiarity we all possess regarding the perceived divergence between these two concepts. I can confidently rely upon a common understanding of this distinction and thus immediately express it using the commonly applied adjectives. Living spirit and dead matter. These terms represent our prevailing perception of the contrast between spirit and matter with reasonable accuracy. From an external standpoint, this perception is undoubtedly valid. It is entirely reasonable for humanity to trust the information received through the senses, and any philosophy instructing us to the contrary is unlikely to gain lasting acceptance in a rational and well-balanced society. No inherent defect exists in the information received by a healthy mind through the senses of a healthy body. The fundamental difficulty arises when we interpret the significance of this information. Our tendency is to form judgments based upon superficial appearances and the restricted meanings we attach to words. Yet, when we begin to question the deeper implications of our words and analyze the causes of appearances, our former beliefs begin to dissolve. Eventually, we awaken to the realization that we inhabit a reality vastly different from that which we once believed. The narrow mindset that once circumscribed our understanding gradually fades, and we find ourselves in a new realm governed by liberty and vitality. This transformation is the result of a conscious and ongoing pursuit of truth, free from the influence of inherited dogmas and focused on thinking independently rather than relying on others to do our thinking for us. Let us then begin by examining what we truly mean when we refer to spirit as living and matter as dead. Initially, we might define life as the capacity for motion and death as the privation thereof. Yet modern scientific findings quickly reveal that this view is inadequate. It is now a well-established fact in physics that no atom of so-called dead matter is devoid of motion. For instance, a solid piece of steel resting on a table appears inert. But according to contemporary science, its constituent atoms are vibrating intensely, moving rapidly in various directions, colliding, rebounding, or orbiting one another like tiny solar systems in an ongoing flurry of activity. Although the mass appears motionless as a whole, it is in fact filled with relentless energy driving its particles at speeds far surpassing that of an express train. Therefore, motion alone cannot explain the fundamental difference we sense between spirit and matter. A deeper understanding is required. The true nature of this distinction does not emerge from comparing life with what we perceive as death. Rather, it becomes clear when we compare the various degrees of life itself. There is a sense in which life as a quality may appear absolute, but there is also a sense in which it varies in degree. We recognize that a plant is alive, yet we also recognize that its life differs significantly from that of an animal. Likewise, most children would rather possess a dog than a goldfish as a companion. Moreover, there is a reason the child represents a more advanced stage of development than the dog. While the plant, fish, dog, and boy are all alive, they express varying degrees of life, and this variation is unquestionably tied to their level of intelligence. However we explore the topic, we continually arrive at the conclusion that the measure of life in any being is ultimately determined by its intelligence. It is intelligence that elevates animals above plants, humans above animals, and intellectual individuals above those who are less developed. Greater intelligence activates higher forms of motion that reflect this elevated capacity. The more intelligent the being, the more fully it controls its own modes of motion. As intelligence decreases, automatic and unconscious movement increases. This decline follows a continuum from the highest expression of human self-awareness down to the most basic visible forms we identify as objects, entirely devoid of self-recognition. Thus, life's vitality is fundamentally expressed through intelligence, or the power of thought. Consequently, we may define the essential quality of spirit as thought and, by contrast, the essential quality of matter as form. We cannot conceive of matter without form. Some form there must be, even though invisible to the physical eye, for matter to be matter at all must occupy space, and to occupy any particular space necessarily implies a corresponding form. For these reasons we may lay it down as a fundamental proposition that the distinctive quality of spirit is thought and the distinctive quality of matter is form. This is a radical distinction from which important consequences follow, and should, therefore, be carefully noted by the student. Form implies extension in space and also limitation within certain boundaries. Thought implies neither. When, therefore, we think of life as existing in any particular form, we associate it with the idea of extension in space, so that an elephant may be said to consist of a vastly larger amount of living substance than a mouse. But if we think of life as the fact of livingness, we do not associate it with any idea of extension, and we at once realize that the mouse is quite as much alive as the elephant, notwithstanding the difference in size. The important point of this distinction is that if we can conceive of anything as entirely devoid of the element of extension in space, it must be present in its entire totality anywhere and everywhere, that is to say, at every point of space simultaneously. The scientific definition of time is that it is the period occupied by a body in passing from one given point in space to another, and, therefore, according to this definition, when there is no space there can be no time, and hence that conception of spirit which realizes it as devoid of the element of space must realize it as being devoid of the element of time also, and we therefore find that the conception of spirit as pure thought, and not as concrete form, is the conception of it as subsisting perfectly independently of the elements of time and space. From this it follows that if the idea of anything is conceived as existing on this level, it can only represent that thing as being actually present here and now. In this view of things, nothing can be remote from us either in time or space. Either the idea is entirely dissipated or it exists as an actual present entity, and not as something that shall be in the future, for where there is no sequence in time there can be no future. Similarly, where there is no space there can be no conception of anything as being at a distance from us. When the elements of time and space are eliminated, all our ideas of things must necessarily be as subsisting in a universal here and an everlasting now. This is, no doubt, a highly abstract conception, but I would ask the student to endeavor to grasp it thoroughly, since it is of vital importance in the practical application of mental science, as will appear further on. The converse conception is that of entities manifesting themselves through the conditions of time and space, thereby establishing a multiplicity of relations with other objects, such as volume, distance, direction, or temporal sequence. These two perspectives represent, respectively, the concepts of the abstract and the concrete, of the unconditioned and the conditioned, of the absolute and the relative. They do not stand in opposition by virtue of mutual incompatibility. Rather, each serves as the complement of the other, and true reality exists solely in their synthesis. The fallacy of the extreme idealist lies in the attempt to realize the absolute to the exclusion of the relative, whereas the error of the extreme materialist consists in seeking to realize the relative in isolation from the absolute. In the former case, the misstep lies in attempting to conceive of an interior without an exterior, and in the latter, in attempting to perceive an exterior devoid of an interior. Yet both dimensions are indispensable to the constitution of a substantial entity. Chapter 2. The higher mode of intelligence controls the lower. We have observed that the transition from personality, as experienced within ourselves, to matter, as manifested in what we designate as inanimate forms, represents a gradual descent in the scale of intelligence. It proceeds from that mode of existence capable of recognizing its own volition as a faculty for initiating new sequences of causation, to that mode of being which is entirely devoid of self-recognition. The more elevated the grade of life, the more advanced is the intelligence, whence it ensues that the supreme principle of life must concurrently constitute the ultimate principle of intelligence. This proposition is luminously demonstrated by the grand natural order of the cosmos. In the light of modern scientific inquiry, the principle of evolution is universally recognized, and the precise equilibrium existing among all constituents of the cosmic design is too manifest to require insistence. Indeed, every scientific advancement consists in the discernment of novel and subtle linkages within this magnificent universal order, which pre-exists and requires only our cognitive recognition to be rendered of practical utility. If, therefore, the most sublime endeavors of the preeminent minds consist solely in the apprehension of an already established order, one cannot escape the conclusion that a supreme intelligence must be inherent within the life principle itself, which manifests as this very order. Consequently, we perceive that a profound cosmic intelligence must underlie the totality of existence. The physical history of our planet reveals, initially, an incandescent nebula dispersed across vast infinities of space. Subsequently, this medium condensed into a central sun enveloped by a system of glowing planets, scarcely consolidated from plastic primordial matter. There followed untold millennia of gradual geological formation, resulting in an Earth populated by the most rudimentary forms of life, both vegetative and animal, from which primitive origins a majestic, uninterrupted, and unhurried progression has brought existence, stage by stage, to the condition we observe today. Contemplating this steady progression, it is evident that, irrespective of how we conceptualize the nature of the evolutionary principle, it unerringly secures the continual advancement of the species. Yet, it achieves this end by generating such vast numbers of each species that, even after allowing a generous margin for all potential vicissitudes befalling individuals, the continuation of the race remains assured. It appears so careful of the type, yet so careless of the single life. In brief, we may posit that cosmic intelligence operates via a law of averages, which permits a substantial margin of misfortune and failure to the individual. Nevertheless, advancement toward a higher state of intelligence consistently tends toward the reduction of this margin of contingency, increasingly liberating the individual from the dominion of the law of averages and substituting in its stead the law of individual selection. In conventional scientific terminology, this phenomenon is designated as the survival of the fittest. The fecundity of marine life is of such a magnitude that it would congest the oceans were every specimen to survive. However, the rate of destruction is commensurately immense, meaning that the law of averages merely preserves the typical proportions of the species. Conversely, at the higher end of the evolutionary scale, reproduction is by no means so vastly in excess of survival. Admittedly, a substantial margin of misfortune and pathology prematurely terminates the lives of numerous human beings before they attain the average life expectancy. Nonetheless, this occurs on a scale vastly different from the premature destruction of hundreds of thousands for the sake of a single survivor. It may, therefore, be regarded as an established fact that, as intelligence advances, the individual ceases to be subject to a mere law of averages, acquiring instead a steadily increasing capacity to govern the conditions of his own survival. Hence, we perceive a distinct demarcation between the cosmic intelligence and individual intelligence, and the distinguishing element that differentiates the latter from the former is the presence of individual volition. The primary objective of mental science, therefore, is to ascertain the relationship between this individual power of volition and the great cosmic law that ensures the preservation and advancement of the species. The salient point to be observed is that the power of individual volition is itself the culmination of the cosmic evolutionary principle at its highest stage of development. The impulse of nature has consistently been upward from the epoch when only the most primitive organisms inhabited the globe, culminating at present in the generation of a being endowed with a mind capable of abstract reasoning and a brain adapted to serve as the physical instrument of such an intellect. At this juncture, the omnific life principle reproduces itself in a form capable of apprehending the operations of the evolutionary law. The unity and continuity of purpose characterizing the entirety of this progression hitherto demonstrate, beyond all dubiety, that the role of such a being within the universal design must be to introduce the operation of that element which has hitherto been conspicuously absent, namely, the factor of intelligent individual volition. The evolution that has elevated us to this vantage point has operated by a cosmic law of averages. It has been a process in which the individual has played no conscious part. However, by virtue of his nature and his position at the vanguard of the evolutionary procession, any further evolution on the part of man must henceforth depend upon his own conscious cooperation with the very law that has brought him to the threshold of recognizing its existence. His future evolution must proceed by way of conscious participation in this grand endeavor, a feat that can be accomplished solely through his own individual intelligence and exertion. This constitutes a process of intellectual growth. None can achieve this development on our behalf. We must each cultivate our own growth. This conscious development consists in our expanding apprehension of the universal law, which has brought us to our present stage of advancement, and of our own individual relation to that law, predicated upon the reality that we ourselves are its most highly developed product. It is a preeminent maxim that nature obeys us precisely in proportion as we first obey nature. Should the electrician attempt to act contrary to the principle that electricity must invariably flow from a higher to a lower potential, his efforts will prove entirely abortive. Yet, should he submit in all respects to this single fundamental law, he may devise whatever specific applications of electrical power he desires. These considerations demonstrate that the defining difference between the higher and lower degrees of intelligence is the recognition of its own selfhood, and the more profound that recognition, the greater the attendant power. The lower degree of self-recognition is that which merely perceives itself as an entity separate from all other entities, as the ego distinguished from the non-ego. But the superior degree of self-recognition is that which, comprehending its own spiritual essence, perceives in all other manifestations not merely the non-ego, or that which is distinct from itself, but rather the alter ego, or that which is itself in an alternative mode of expression. It is precisely this elevated state of self-awareness that constitutes the efficacy through which the mental scientist achieves his endeavors. Consequently, it is imperative that he apprehend with utmost clarity the distinction between form and being, the former representing the modality of the relative and the emblem of subordination to external circumstances, whilst the latter embodies the verity of the absolute, possessing sovereign dominion over all conditions. This superior apprehension of the self as an individualization of pure spirit must, by logical necessity, command all lower modalities of spirit that have not yet attained a commensurate level of self-awareness. These subordinate modalities of spirit remain subject to the laws of their own existence due to their ignorance of those laws. Hence, the individual who has acquired this comprehension is enabled to govern them by means of that very law. Yet, to fully grasp this principle, we must investigate more deeply into the nature of spirit. I have previously demonstrated that the magnificent scale of adaptation and harmonization of all components within the cosmic design points to the existence of a sublime underlying intelligence. The inquiry then arises: where is this intelligence situated? Ultimately, we can conceive of it only as inherent within some primordial substance, which serves as the foundational source of all those denser modalities of matter familiar to us, whether discernible to the physical eye or logically deduced by science from their observable effects. It represents that power which, within every species and every individual, becomes the very essence of that species or individual. Thus, we must conceptualize it as a self-fashioning intelligence immanent in the ultimate substance of which every entity is a specific manifestation. That this primordial substance must be regarded as self-generating through an immanent intelligence residing within itself is demonstrated by the truth that intelligence is the defining attribute of spirit. Were we to conceptualize the primordial substance as distinct from spirit, we would be compelled to postulate some alternative force, neither spiritual nor material, which engenders both. Yet this merely displaces the concept of a self-evolving power by one degree and presumes the generation of a subordinate grade of undifferentiated spirit by a superior one, an assumption that is both entirely unwarranted and antithetical to any coherent conception of undifferentiated spirit. Regardless of how far back we project the primordial point of origin, we cannot evade the conclusion that, at that juncture, spirit contains the primary substance within itself, thereby returning us to the traditional axiom that it fashioned all things out of nothing. We thus discern two constituents in the creation of all things, spirit and nothingness, and the addition of nothingness to spirit yields only spirit. X plus 0 equals X. From these deliberations, we perceive that the ultimate foundation of every material form is spirit, and consequently, that a universal intelligence pervades all nature, inherent in each of its manifestations. However, this latent intelligence does not pertain to the specific form save to the degree that the form is physically adapted to concentrate it into a self-conscious individuality. It remains concealed within that primordial substance of which the tangible form is a denser manifestation. This primordial substance constitutes a philosophical necessity, and we can conceptualize it only as something infinitely more subtle than the atoms, which are themselves a theoretical inference of physical science. Nevertheless, for lack of a more precise terminology, we may conveniently designate this primary intelligence, immanent in the very essence of things, as the atomic intelligence. Though this term may be subject to certain objections, it suffices for our present inquiry by distinguishing this particular modality of spiritual intelligence from its opposite pole, namely, the individual intelligence. This distinction warrants careful consideration, as it is through the responsiveness of the atomic intelligence to the individual intelligence that the power of thought is capable of affecting results upon the material plane, as demonstrated in the alleviation of disease through mental therapeutics and similar phenomena. Intelligence manifests itself through responsiveness, and the entire operation of the cosmic mind, in guiding the evolutionary process from its initial genesis to its current human stage, is nothing other than a continuous, intelligent response to the demands exerted by each progressive phase for a harmonization between itself and its environment. Having therefore acknowledged the presence of a universal intelligence permeating all things, we must likewise recognize a corresponding responsiveness latent within their deepest nature, poised to be activated when invoked. All mental therapeutics depend upon this responsiveness of spirit in its subordinate degrees to the superior degrees of itself. It is herein that the divergence between the mental scientist and the uninitiated lies. The former is cognizant of this responsiveness and utilizes it, whereas the latter is unable to employ it due to his ignorance thereof. Chapter 3. The Unity of the Spirit. We have now prepared the way for comprehending what is signified by the unity of the Spirit. In the primary conception of spirit as the fundamental source of all existence, we discern a universal substance that, at this stage, remains undifferentiated into any specific forms. This is not a matter of some historical epoch, but rather subsists at every moment throughout all time within the innermost nature of all being. When we perceive this, we recognize that the apparent division between one specific form and another rests upon a profound, essential unity that sustains the various individualities arising from it. Furthermore, as our contemplation penetrates more deeply into the nature of this all-engendering spiritual substance, we perceive that it cannot be confined to any single region of space, but must remain as limitless as space itself, rendering the conception of any spatial coordinate where it is absent entirely untenable. It is one of those intuitive apprehensions from which the human intellect can never escape that this primordial, all-generating, living spirit must be commensurate with infinitude. Consequently, we can never conceptualize it as other than universal or infinite. It is, moreover, a mathematical verity that the infinite must constitute a unity. One cannot possess two infinites, for in such a scenario neither would be truly infinite, each being circumscribed by the other, nor can one divide the infinite into fractions. The infinite, by mathematical necessity, is essential unity. This is a principle upon which too much emphasis cannot be placed, for from it follow consequences of the utmost significance. Unity, by its very nature, can be neither multiplied nor divided, as either operation would dismantle its status as a unit. By multiplication, we generate a plurality of units commensurate in scale with the original, whereas by division, we produce a plurality of units of a diminished scale. Yet a plurality of units constitutes not unity but multiplicity. Consequently, if we desire to penetrate beneath the external aspect of the individual to that innermost principle of his existence from which his individuality emerges, we can do so only by transcending the concept of individual existence and entering into that of the unity of universal being. This may seem to be a purely philosophical abstraction, yet the student who aspires to achieve practical results must realize that these abstract generalizations form the very foundation of the practical endeavors he intends to undertake. The paramount truth to be recognized regarding a unity is that, by virtue of its being a single unit, wherever it exists in any measure, it must exist in its entirety. The instant we permit our intellect to diverge toward the concept of spatial extension, asserting that one portion of the unit resides here and another there, we descend from the conception of unity into that of divisions or fractions of a single entity. This transition introduces the concept of a multiplicity of lesser units, wherein we find ourselves engaged with the relative, that is, the relation subsisting between two or more entities which, by virtue of this very relation, limit one another, thereby departing from the realm of simple unity which constitutes the absolute. Consequently, it is a mathematical necessity that, owing to the infinitude of the originating life principle, it must exist as a singular unit. Therefore, wherever it is present to any degree, it must be present in its entirety. Furthermore, by virtue of its infinite and boundless nature, it is omnipresent. Hence, it follows axiomatically that the entirety of spirit must coexist at every spatial point simultaneously. Spirit is thus omnipresent in its completeness, rendering it logically sound to assert that at any given moment, the whole of spirit is concentrated at whatever spatial point we choose to direct our attention. This constitutes the fundamental reality of all existence, and it is for this reason that I have paved the way for its comprehension by defining the relationship between spirit and matter as analogous to that between idea and form, the former representing the absolute, from which the dimensions of time and space are entirely excluded, and the latter representing the relative, which is utterly contingent upon those dimensions. This profound truth dictates that pure spirit perpetually subsists within the absolute, irrespective of its embodiment in a corporeal form, and from this source emanate all the phenomena of existence, whether manifest upon the mental or the physical plane. Cognizance of this spiritual truth forms the foundation of all conscious spiritual operation. Consequently, in proportion to our deepening apprehension of it, our capacity to generate outward, visible manifestations through the agency of our thought will expand. The whole exceeds the part. Therefore, if, through our realization of this unity, we can focus the entirety of spirit upon any designated point at any moment, we thereby encompass whatever individualization of it we desire to address. The practical significance of this deduction is too self-evident to require further elaboration. Pure spirit represents the life principle conceptualized independently of the matrix wherein it assumes spatiotemporal relations within a specific form. In this regard, it exists as pure intelligence, undifferentiated into individual personality. Being pure intelligence, it possesses infinite responsiveness and susceptibility. Divested of any relation to time and space, it is likewise devoid of individual personality. Consequently, in this aspect, it remains a thoroughly impersonal element upon which, by virtue of its intrinsic intelligence and susceptibility, we may impress any conception of personality we choose. These are the momentous truths with which the mental scientist operates, and the student would be wise to reflect deeply upon their significance and the profound responsibilities that their realization must inevitably entail. Chapter 4. Subjective and Objective Mind. Hitherto, it has been necessary to establish the foundations of this science by articulating highly abstract general principles, arrived at through purely metaphysical reasoning. We now proceed to consider certain natural laws established by an extensive series of experiments and observations, the full import and significance of which will become manifest when we observe their application to the general principles that have thus far engaged our attention. The phenomena of hypnosis are today so thoroughly acknowledged as established scientific facts that any discussion regarding their credibility is entirely superfluous. Two preeminent medical schools have been founded upon these phenomena, and in several jurisdictions, they have become the subject of specific legislation. The inquiry before us today concerns not the credibility of these facts, but rather the proper inferences to be deduced from them. A precise apprehension of these deductions serves as an invaluable aid to the mental scientist, for it validates the conclusions of purely a priori reasoning through a body of experimental evidence that places the accuracy of those conclusions beyond all doubt. The profound truth which the science of hypnotism has brought to light is the dual nature of the human mind. Considerable debate exists among various authors as to whether this duality arises from the coexistence of two distinct minds within a single individual, or from the operation of a single mind exercising diverse functions. This is one of those distinctions without a difference that so frequently obstruct the disclosure of truth. An individual must possess a singular identity to exist as a coherent agent. Thus, the ultimate conclusion remains identical whether we conceptualize these diverse modes of mental activity as originating from a series of distinct minds suspended, as it were, upon the thread of a single individuality, each adapted to a specific purpose, or as the varied functions of a solitary mind. In either case, we are dealing with a single individuality, and the manner in which we conceptualize the internal workings of the mental apparatus is merely a question of which mental model illustrates the nature of its operation most clearly. Accordingly, for the sake of convenience, I shall in these discourses refer to this dual activity as though it emanated from two distinct minds, the outer and the inner. The inner mind we shall designate the subjective mind, and the outer the objective, as these terms most frequently denote this distinction within the relevant literature. An extensive series of meticulous experiments conducted by highly trained observers, including individuals of international renown, has firmly established certain remarkable differences between the operations of the subjective and the objective minds, which may be briefly summarized as follows. The subjective mind is capable only of deductive reasoning, whereas the objective mind possesses the capacity for both induction and deduction. Deductive reasoning operates through the pure syllogism, demonstrating why a tertiary proposition must inevitably follow if two premises are assumed, though it does not assist in determining the truth or falsity of those initial premises. To ascertain this truth is the province of inductive reasoning, which derives its conclusions from the systematic observation of a body of facts. The relationship between these two modes of reasoning is such that, by first observing a sufficient number of instances, we inductively arrive at the conclusion that a specific principle is of universal application. We then initiate the deductive process by assuming the validity of this principle and determining what consequences must ensue in a specific case under the hypothesis of its truth. Thus, deductive reasoning proceeds upon the assumed correctness of the initial hypotheses or suppositions with which it begins. It is unconcerned with the actual truth or falsity of these premises, focusing solely upon the consequences that must logically follow should they be assumed true. Inductive reasoning, conversely, is the method whereby we compare a multitude of separate instances until we discern the common factor from which they all originate. Induction proceeds by the comparison of empirical facts, whereas deduction operates through the application of universal principles. It is exclusively the deductive method that is employed by the subjective mind. Countless experiments performed upon subjects in a state of hypnosis demonstrate that the subjective mind is entirely incapable of the selection and comparison essential to the inductive process. It will instead accept any suggestion, regardless of its falsity. However, once a suggestion has been accepted, the subjective mind behaves with rigorous logic in deducing the appropriate conclusions, working out every premise to the most minute consequence. Consequently, it follows that the subjective mind remains entirely subordinate to the control of the objective mind. With the utmost fidelity, it reproduces and works out to its ultimate consequences whatever impressions the objective mind imparts to it. Moreover, the phenomena of hypnotism demonstrate that ideas may be impressed upon the subjective mind not only by its own individual objective consciousness but also by that of another. This constitutes a point of paramount significance, as it is upon this very susceptibility to suggestion by the thought of another that all phenomena of healing, whether proximal or remote, as well as telepathy and cognate occurrences, depend. Under the governance of a skilled practitioner of hypnotism, the very persona of the subject is temporarily transfigured. He believes himself to be precisely what the operator dictates. He is a swimmer breasting the waves, a bird soaring through the air, a soldier amidst the tumult of battle, or an Indian stealthily tracking his victim. In short, for the duration of this state, he identifies himself with whichever personality is impressed upon him by the operator's will, executing the role with peerless accuracy. Yet, the demonstrations of hypnotism extend far beyond these observations, revealing within the subjective mind faculties that greatly transcend any exerted by the objective mind through the medium of the physical senses. These include the phenomena of thought reading, thought transference, clairvoyance, and similar capabilities, all of which frequently manifest when the subject is elevated to the higher mesmeric states. We are thus provided with empirical proof of the existence within ourselves of transcendental faculties, the mature development and conscious governance of which would elevate us to an entirely novel sphere of existence. It must be observed, however, that this governance must remain strictly our own, rather than that of any external intelligence, whether incarnate or discarnate. Yet perhaps the most momentous revelation afforded by hypnotic experimentation is that the subjective mind is the architect of the physical body. The subjective entity within the patient is capable of diagnosing the nature of the malady afflicting him and prescribing appropriate remedies, thereby exhibiting a physiological comprehension that surpasses that of the most highly trained physicians, alongside an understanding of the correspondences between the morbid states of bodily organs and the material remedies capable of providing alleviation. From this point, it is but a minor transition to those manifold instances wherein it entirely dispenses with the use of material remedies and operates directly upon the physical organism, such that complete restoration to health ensues from suggestions of perfect soundness imparted by the operator to the patient during the hypnotic state. These facts are thoroughly established by hundreds of experiments conducted by diverse investigators across the globe, from which we may deduce two inferences of the utmost significance. First, that the subjective mind is, in its essential nature, absolutely impersonal, and second, that it is the architect of the body or, in other terms, the creative potency within the individual. Its inherent impersonality is demonstrated by its promptness in assuming whatever personality the hypnotist deigns to impress upon it. Consequently, the inevitable deduction is that its realization of personality derives from its association with the specific objective mind of its own individuality. Whatever persona the objective mind imparts to it, that persona it adopts and exemplifies. And since it is the architect of the body, it will fashion a physical vehicle corresponding to the personality thus impressed upon it. These twin laws of the subjective mind constitute the foundation of the axiom that our body represents the aggregate of our beliefs. If our established conviction is that the body is subject to various influences beyond our governance, and that any given symptom indicates the operation of such an uncontrollable force upon us, then this belief is impressed upon the subjective mind. By the very law of its nature, the subjective mind accepts this premise unquestioningly and proceeds to shape bodily conditions in accordance with this belief. Conversely, if our settled belief is that specific material remedies are the sole means of recovery, we find in this conviction the foundation of all medicine. There is nothing inherently invalid in the theory of medicine. It represents a strictly logical correspondence with the degree of comprehension that those who rely upon it are currently capable of assimilating, operating accurately in accordance with their belief that, in many instances, medicine will prove beneficial, though in many cases it likewise fails. Therefore, for those who have not yet attained a more profound interior perception of the laws of nature, the therapeutic agency of medicine remains a highly valuable aid in the alleviation of physical maladies. The error to be contested is not the belief that medicine, in its own sphere, is capable of effecting good, but rather the conviction that no superior or more elevated path exists. By parity of reasoning, if we comprehend that the subjective mind is the architect of the body, and that the physical organism is subject to no influences save those that reach it through the subjective mind, then our duty is to impress this truth upon the subjective mind and habitually regard it as a fount of perpetual life. This fountain continually rejuvenates the body by constructing it with robust and wholesome material, entirely independent of external influences of any description, save those of our own desire impressed upon our subjective mind by our own conscious thought. Once we have fully grasped these considerations, we shall perceive that it is quite as simple to externalize healthy physical conditions as it is to manifest their opposites. In practical terms, the process resolves into a belief in our own vital capacity, and since this conviction, if thoroughly established within us, must inevitably produce a correspondingly healthy body, we should spare no effort to assure ourselves of the rational and valid grounds for harboring it. To provide a resilient foundation for this conviction is the primary objective of mental science. Chapter 5. Further considerations regarding subjective and objective mind. An intelligent analysis of the phenomena of hypnotism reveals that what we term the hypnotic state is, in truth, the normal condition of the subjective mind. It invariably conceives of itself in accordance with whatever suggestion is imparted to it, whether consciously or unconsciously, by the objective mind that governs it, thereby generating corresponding external results. The anomalous nature of the states induced by experimental hypnotism lies in the suspension of the customary control exerted by the individual's own objective mind over his subjective mind, and the substitution of an external governance. Thus, we may assert that the distinguishing characteristic of the subjective mind is its perpetual operation in accordance with some form of suggestion. Consequently, it becomes a question of paramount importance to determine in every instance the nature of the suggestion and the source from which it shall emanate. Yet, prior to examining the sources of suggestion, we must comprehend more fully the position occupied by the subjective mind in the natural order. If the student has followed the preceding discussion regarding the immanence of an intelligent spirit pervading all space and permeating all matter, he will now find little difficulty in recognizing this all-pervading spirit as the universal subjective mind. That it cannot, in its capacity as the universal mind, possess the attributes of the objective mind is highly manifest. The universal mind is the creative potency throughout nature, and as the primary originating power, it must first bring into being the various forms wherein the objective mind recognizes its own individuality, before these individual minds can react upon it. Hence, as pure spirit or first cause, it cannot conceivably be anything other than subjective mind. Moreover, the fact, copiously demonstrated by experiment, that the subjective mind is the architect of the physical body, reveals that the capacity to create via growth from within is the essential characteristic of the subjective mind. Consequently, derived both from empirical experimentation and a priori reasoning, we may assert that wherever creative power is operative, we are in the presence of the subjective mind, whether it functions upon the grand scale of the cosmos or the miniature scale of the individual. We may therefore establish it as a fundamental principle that the universal, all-permeating intelligence, examined in the second and third sections, is entirely subjective mind. Consequently, it conforms to the law of the subjective mind. It is highly amenable to suggestion and will execute any impression made upon it to its most rigorously logical conclusions. The profound significance of this truth may not immediately apprehend the student. Nevertheless, a brief contemplation will reveal the immense possibilities latent within it, and in the concluding section, I shall cursorily address the grave conclusions arising therefrom. For the present, it suffices to comprehend that the subjective mind within us is identical to the subjective mind operating throughout the universe, which engenders the infinitude of natural forms surrounding us and, in like manner, brings ourselves into being. It may be designated as the sustainer of our individuality, and we may, in a broader sense, refer to our individual subjective mind as our personal participation in the universal mind. This, naturally, does not imply the fragmentation of the universal mind into distinct parts. Indeed, it was to forestall this misconception that I delineated the essential unity of spirit in the third section. However, to avoid excessively abstract formulations at this stage of the student's progress, we may advantageously employ the concept of a personal share in the universal subjective mind. Perceiving our individual subjective mind in this manner will facilitate the resolution of the formidable metaphysical difficulty encountered in our efforts to make conscious use of the first cause, that is, to generate external results through the efficacy of our own thought. Ultimately, there can exist but one primary cause, which is the universal mind. Yet, by virtue of its universality, it cannot, in its universal capacity, operate upon the plane of the individual and the particular. To do so would require it to divest itself of its universal character, thereby ceasing to be the creative power we desire to employ. Conversely, our pursuit of a specific and definite objective implies an intention to apply this universal power to a particular purpose, thereby entangling us in the paradox of seeking to compel the universal to act upon the plane of the particular. We desire to effect a synthesis between the two extremes of the natural scale, the innermost creative spirit and a specific external manifestation. Between these two lies a vast chasm, and the query arises as to how it may be bridged. It is precisely here that the conception of our individual subjective mind as our personal share in the universal subjective mind provides the means to resolve this difficulty. For, on the one hand, it stands in direct communion with the universal mind, while on the other, it is immediately linked with the individual objective or intellectual mind. This, in turn, is directly connected with the world of externalization, which is conditioned by time and space. Thus, the relationship between the subjective and objective minds within the individual constitutes the necessary bridge linking the two extremities of the scale. The individual subjective mind may therefore be regarded as the organ of the absolute in precisely the same manner as the objective mind is the organ of the relative. It is for the purpose of regulating our employment of these two organs that we must comprehend the true signification of the terms absolute and relative. The absolute represents that conception of an object which regards it as existing per se, independent of external relations, that is to say, which contemplates its essential nature. Conversely, the relative is that conception which regards an object in relation to other entities, circumscribed by a specific environment. The absolute constitutes the domain of causes, whereas the relative represents the domain of conditions. Consequently, if we desire to govern conditions, we can achieve this only through our thought power operating upon the plane of the absolute, a feat possible solely through the mediation of the subjective mind. The conscious exercise of the creative power of thought lies in acquiring the capacity to think in the absolute, and this can be attained only through a lucid comprehension of the interaction between our diverse mental functions. To this end, the student must indelibly impress upon his mind that the subjective mind, irrespective of its scale, is exquisitely sensitive to suggestion and, as a creative potency, operates with precision to externalize whatever suggestion has been most deeply inscribed upon it. If, therefore, we wish to extract an idea from the realm of the relative, wherein it is circumscribed and restricted by conditions imposed by surrounding circumstances, and translate it into the realm of the absolute, where no such limitations exist, a correct understanding of our mental constitution will enable us to achieve this through a well-defined methodology. The object of our desire is inevitably first conceived as standing in some relation to existing circumstances, which may or may not appear propitious. Our objective, therefore, is to eliminate the element of contingency and secure that which is inherently certain. To accomplish this is to operate upon the plane of the absolute, and to this end, we must endeavor to impress upon the subjective mind the concept of our desire, entirely divorced from any conditioning factors. This detachment from conditional elements necessitates the elimination of the concept of time. Consequently, we must conceive of the object as already possessing actual existence. Failing this, we are not consciously operating upon the plane of the absolute, and we consequently fail to employ the creative power of our thought. The most straightforward and practical method of cultivating this habit of thought is to conceive of a spiritual prototype for every existing object within the spiritual realm, which serves as the origin of its corresponding external manifestation. If we thus accustom ourselves to regard the spiritual prototype as the essential being of the entity, and the material form as the development of this prototype into outward expression, we shall perceive that the primary step toward the production of any external reality must be the creation of its spiritual prototype. This prototype, being entirely spiritual, can be fashioned solely through the operation of thought, and to possess substance upon the spiritual plane, it must be conceived as already existing there. This concept was elaborated by Plato in his doctrine of archetypal ideas, and by Swedenborg in his doctrine of correspondences. Moreover, an even greater teacher declared, "All things whatsoever ye pray and ask for, believe that ye have received them, and ye shall receive them." The distinction of tenses in this passage is highly remarkable. The speaker enjoins us first to believe that our desire is already fulfilled, that it is an accomplished fact, whereupon its materialization will ensue as a future occurrence. This is nothing less than a concise directive for utilizing the creative power of thought by impressing upon the universal subjective mind the specific object of our desire as an already established reality. By adhering to this instruction, we think upon the plane of the absolute, eliminating from our minds all consideration of conditions, which imply limitation and the potential for adverse contingencies, and we thereby plant a seed which, if left undisturbed, will infallibly germinate into external fruition. By thus employing the subjective mind with intelligence, we establish, as it were, a nucleus. Upon its very creation, this nucleus begins to exert an attractive force, drawing to itself material of a corresponding character. And if this process remains undisturbed, it will persist until an external form, commensurate with the nature of the nucleus, manifests upon the plane of the objective and the relative. Such is the universal methodology of nature across every plane of existence. In their endeavors to fathom the profound mystery of cosmic origins, some of the most preeminent theorists in modern physical science have postulated the creation of what they term vortex rings, generated from an infinitely refined. Do you want access to this and all the complete audiobooks on the channel, plus the ebook version? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code in the left corner of the screen to access our library, where you can listen to your favorite esoteric books without ad interruptions, lock your screen, or use other apps while the narration plays, and even download the ebook version to follow along as you listen. Listen on your computer via web browser, or download the app from the Play Store. After subscribing, you will receive an email with your login details, password, and step-by-step instructions on how to access the books through the Hotmart app.